All right, hello everyone. My name is Amanda Zieda. I'm a reporter here with Government CIO Media. All right. We have the critical infrastructure panel and then lunch, so almost there. All right, so to introduce my panelists, on my far right, we have Dylan Connor, CTO of ID Technologies, Scott Bean, the Assistant Director for IT Infrastructure Division, FBI. We have Saber Horn, Director of the Stakeholder Engagement and Cyber Infrastructure Resilience Division at DHS. And right here we have Jacob Torrey, Program Manager at DARPA. Thank you all for joining us today. I want to start by asking you each to describe your position, your role, and how it pertains to the critical infrastructure sector. We'll start with you, Jacob.
Great. So I'm at DARPA's Information Innovation Office, so a program manager. We're only there for a few years before we're sucked dry and move on elsewhere. And what we try to do is kind of invest in transformative technology in a certain area. And so I've been coming in looking at the intersection of operational technology and information technology, and then also incorporating human behavior in these constrained critical infrastructure environments.
All right. Sabra.
I'm Saber Horn. I'll just speak really loudly. Thank you. Thank you. Saber Horn, I'm the Director of Seeker. Within Seeker, we are the stakeholder engagement group that serves all of MPPD within DHS. Our goal is to connect with our private sector partners and our state and local partners to ensure that we're working across all 16 critical infrastructure sectors to ensure that we are sharing that which we know within the government, as well as hearing from private sector and SLTT partners to gather the information that they know, so together we're stronger.
All right, Scott.
Thank you. My name's Scott Bean, Assistant Director for IT Infrastructure for the FBI. So separate and apart from our cyber division, which handles our cyber investigations and deals with private industry and with government in terms of cyber protection and investigating cyber crime, I'm actually on the implementation side of doing IT for the Bureau. In my role, I oversee all the FBI's networks across all enclaves, so our unclassified, secret, top secret, and our BlackNet transport network, all of our data centers, and when I say our, I mean not only the FBI's, but also the Department of Justice. As we've consolidated down our data center footprint, we are mainly running the two CEFs for the department, one in Clarksburg, West Virginia, and then one out in Pocatello, Idaho, that's under construction now. So soon we'll have the two main data centers for the department and all components. I also have our mobility solutions, so all of our secure laptops, cell phones, all of that. So I won't be answering any text questions today or any personal SMS message questions today, but you know, I did put the cell phones in those hands, so I guess I have to take some level of responsibility. And then beyond that, I also have some responsibility for our cloud effort in terms of building out our on-premise cloud solutions, but also in our secret commercial cloud solution, work with industry to develop those solutions, get them on board. So that's kind of the roundup of everything that's in my division.
So my name is Dylan Connor. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for ID Technologies. We are a infrastructure and cyber-focused technology provider, and we sit at the intersection between our end-user customers and industry. And my role there is to help find innovative solutions for problems that, you know, I think we all struggle with.
All right, wonderful, thank you. And I just want to remind everyone to keep tweeting with the hashtag CXONatSec, and you can see your tweets pop up there. Okay, so I want to start by asking, what critical infrastructure sector do you find to be most at risk or threatening? Saber, we'll start with you since you are also at the local, state, and federal level.
That's great. Within DHS, we do think that all of the critical infrastructure sectors are important, all 16 of them. We also now have a new subsector, which is the elections subsector infrastructure area, which was deemed part of critical infrastructure last January. Certainly, I think it was really important that you all pointed out for this panel today the focus on the electrical, financial services, and IT infrastructure areas. We feel that those are, I think, very important in terms of us understanding how they're interconnected, We understand that there is systemic risk, that when you have one sector, it's virtually impossible for them not to be connected to another sector. We saw with the WannaCry incident, vast within almost 24 hours, over 150 countries were somehow impacted by a relatively simple ransomware cyber threat. But yet, because of the interconnected nature of how our infrastructures work, there were very many who had been affected by the unfortunate incident. So our goal here is to ensure that we understand what that interconnectedness is, we understand the risks within the various sectors, and that we're working to help us all raise our level of preparedness together.
Scott?
I completely agree with what Saber was just saying. All of them are important. There are certainly the key ones. Electrical is a huge one, and then also, of course, the IT infrastructure. That becomes even more important as we bring more and more capabilities online, as we bring more of the Internet of Things, as we bring more AI and machine learning to bear. Every one of those additional things that we add to our networks is another potential attack vector into our networks. So we have to be very careful about how we are securing those things like IoT devices or commercial controls, how we are securing those things and how we're keeping them updated against new and emerging threats.
So I don't know if this is actually a formal critical infrastructure area, but I think the infrastructure associated with identity is under threat. I think that in this age of media and social media and the ability to instantly have a public voice, I think that the ability to be anonymous and to maintain your own identity is actually another area that's critical.
All right. And Jacob, would you like to add anything? Or? Okay. Well, let's jump into the two programs you work on. And I know we talked about red teaming before and how that intersects with this conversation.
Sure. So I have two programs I think fall nicely under this umbrella of infrastructure, critical infrastructure. I'm much more of a technologist, so I'm kind of to defer all policy questions to the folks on my right. So I think there are two kind of important needs here. When you're talking about critical infrastructure, the idea of fail-safe kind of means something separate from something in an IT infrastructure. Maybe you might want to default to closing a port or locking someone out in an IT environment. In an operational environment, if something's on fire, say at an oil well, fail-safe may be something very different where you kind of default back to allowing people in remotely and to be able to turn that off and make something safe. So you have this kind of interesting place where the IT world is being connected to the OT world. And I have two programs. One is looking at how do we protect legacy systems. And when I say legacy systems, I mean everything that you can buy on the market today, because by the time it's come to market, it's already been through this long process of requirements, development, certification, and actually kind of shipping. And so by the time something's out, it's already considered legacy. So how do we mitigate the vulnerabilities that are inevitably going to show up? And how do we provide kind of broad and long-term protections against those types of vulnerabilities for legacy systems? And the second one is looking at if all of those systems we assume are somehow protected, how do you configure those? It's quite likely that you can configure systems insecurely even if they are in themselves securely. So this all came from some work that I did before when I was actually red teaming some industrial control systems. We were targeting how to remotely trigger cyber attacks that would cause loss of life or limb. And what was shocking was not that in 2 weeks we were able to, having never seen the system before, be able to get in and achieve almost all of our goals to that end, but it was that we never had to write a single buffer overflow or exploit or malware. All we were using was default configurations or unsafe extra functionality that was there, because these systems are just COTS all off the shelf. And the vendors of that want to make sure that works in a turnkey fashion across the board. And so they want every feature in there, and they kind of leave it up for the integrator to be able to put that all together. And so what we found is you can cause some really devastating effects with basically the low-hanging fruit of default passwords, diagnostic ports and other things left open, and just using the functionality that's kind of built into the system and left on because the system works. Why would you turn it off?
So what do you find to be the most challenging aspects of trying to patch these vulnerabilities in the work that you're doing now?
Well, so what's interesting is my first program doesn't actually try to patch vulnerabilities. It tries to put them in such a way where they have been mitigated. So we take broad classes of attacks off the table. So the vulnerabilities, I think it's very difficult to patch those and keep up with it. I mean, we're seeing IoT devices that are essentially unpatchable, or you're moving from the notion of 0 day to an end days to forever days, where the company's gone out of business and now you have essentially this kind of attack surface sitting out there. So we're looking at techniques using structured binary diversification to be able to actually say, okay, it doesn't matter if there's a vulnerability in there, as long as it's in the stack or the heap or the globals of the program, we can make sure that it can't actually allow an attacker to cause any type of negative effect.
Okay, and similarly, Scott, considering your global footprint and outreach, what challenges do you face trying to secure these complex systems?
Certainly, especially as we're providing support to our legal attaché offices around the world and trying to provide connectivity to our resident agencies, our small offices that are spread out around the country. We're having to look at a variety of different network mechanisms to enable that. So sometimes we're using our own network infrastructure, sometimes we're riding on commercial infrastructure, and then being very careful on how we secure and encrypt our traffic across those networks. But also looking at how do we provide cyber hygiene instruction to our folks so they know what to look out for in their own use of these technologies, especially as we make things more and more mobile, more and more flexible for our folks. How do we teach them to use those tools effectively and securely on the user end so they can spot an anomaly and help us as we're tracking down threats as well?
And Saber, what are those systemic risk challenges that you face in your department?
Well, obviously, I think one of our biggest challenges is scaling to the challenge. We see that there are cyber threats that cross all 16 sectors, and as Scott indicated, I think we're trying to figure out as quickly as possible how we go about prioritizing those risks so that we can utilize government resources to be most effective in addressing those risks. So there is what's called our Section 9 companies. It was based on an executive order from 2015, which articulated there are a finite number of very high-risk companies that, should they be impacted by a cyber threat, would have devastating consequences and cascading consequences across multiple sectors. We try to ensure that we've done what we need to do to provide them the information they need, the resources they need. Now, of course, not every private sector company does need support from the government, so we're also trying to do what we can to support small and medium-sized businesses, which doesn't have the same amount of resources available to them in terms of being able to pay for private sector companies that would come in and do threat assessments or things of that sort. So given the wide resources that we have across DHS, we've been able to help create a roadmap for our small, medium-sized businesses to help them sort through the various resources that DHS offers so that they can identify what resources would be most specific in addressing their needs, and then they can access it that way.
All right. And Dylan, I wanted to ask how hardware security falls into this. Why is it so important in terms of securing critical infrastructure, and is it overlooked?
Yeah, no, I think it oftentimes is overlooked. I think that when you talk about security, oftentimes you're talking about policy or physical security or network security. And the devices that we held in our hands and carry in our pockets and are everywhere. I mean, I think that this TV is probably a computer. These speakers are probably computers. You have attack surfaces everywhere. And I think the general IT security focus has been on the network. And I think that as we move into a more distributed security environment, that we're going to have to start paying attention to hardware configuration security more.
Mm-hmm.
I think Dylan makes a good point there. Understanding your supply chain, understanding where your gear is coming from and who's touching it before you get it and put it into use in your systems is critically important and will continue to be important as we move forward.
And is this where you prioritize risk management?
I think that the commercial sector is oftentimes motivated by financial pressures, which of course is their job, and the government's motivated by a higher calling, a moral authority, right? The government has a mission, no matter what the mission is, and I think that it's time for our commercial industries to start paying more attention because they also have a responsibility for all of our safety.
Actually, I'll add on to what Dylan just indicated, which is we agree, which is private sector, as owners and operators of more than 90% of the critical infrastructure, and especially such a important customer in terms of our ability to understand who is being affected by the cyber threat, there's a responsibility that we all have in ensuring that we're working together to raise that level of protection collectively. And so we do see that private sector has a very important role to play. We'd like them to work with us to become more secure, but thank you for making that important point. We believe in the bi-directional sharing of information, ensuring that not only is the government able to provide the information that they know, which can't be known by private sector, but we also have to ensure that private sector is sharing with the government that which they know, so that we're able to quickly address the threats as they arise.
Right. And Saber, to that point, how does your department prioritize the risk that it provides to critical infrastructure companies and sectors? Is that a challenge as well?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the Section 9 companies are very important. We do try to look across all 16 sectors and understand from a cyber perspective where the risk lies. We're also working with companies to understand precisely what risks exist. I'd like to mention we just stood up what's called our Tri-Sector Council, which consists of the electrical, financial services, and the IT sector, where they're going to be specifically focusing on identifying what those areas of risk are so that we can work together to come up with incident response. And I'd like to highlight that they're even working on understanding what the triggers of cyber attacks might be across those sectors so they can address that very proactively.
And Scott, once those threats are detected, what are the consequences of a hacker or nation-state actor trying to infiltrate a system that could cause catastrophic events to our critical infrastructure?
Certainly. So, whether it's a nation-state actor or whether it's a hacker working out of their grandmother's basement, what we have to look out for is not just the intended consequence, whether that's turning on a valve or overloading a circuit or siphoning data. It's also the unintended consequences, the potential catastrophic cascading consequences that can come out from turning off electrical supply to an ICU in a hospital. Opening up a valve on a dam. There are huge risks involved here, and that's why the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, all of us in government that have interaction with our state and local governments, with law enforcement, with the first responder community, and with industry, have to make sure that we're being smart about talking about securing those systems, providing resources and advice where we can do so and where it makes sense for us to do so, and encourage good behavior on the part of the whole of the community, whether it's the private sector or the public sector.
And I will just add, Scott, thank you for those comments. We certainly see the concept of systemic risk within various sectors, which is if one component within a sector has been affected, it's highly likely that not only will many other components be affected, but that will spill over and cascade into additional sectors. So addressing systemic risk, both from a government partnership, as Scott had indicated, as well as the partnership with private sector is fundamental. We're trying to build what we call the collective defense of what we're able to accomplish together, which is together we're going to be able to be stronger, and only by working together and knowing what each other knows we'll be better off.
And Jacob, considering the programs that you're working on, does legacy technology increase this risk? And
yeah, I think there's kind of two elements. One is there's the actual legacy technology itself, which I think the risks are fairly well known. I think the other issue is more to your systemic risk is a lot of the companies that are fielding this, they're very highly capitalized. They have very little to invest in proactive cybersecurity, but the downsides, the externalities of a breach are massively impactful beyond them. So the power grid is a great example. Power utilities are highly regulated, highly capitalized, and really the only times they can raise their rates is when there's some kind of crisis, so in the event of compromise. And so, but we all depend on them in the systemic risk, and they've all been kind of through innovation connected. We have a program, Radix, which is looking at how do you secure the power grid when the utilities don't really want to trust the DoD being on their network? How do we look through the power grid through kind of clever analytic techniques to be able to detect and respond to cyber attacks against the power grid before they become this very big crisis? And so that's something that we're looking at as well, is that there's also kind of the economic and the business challenges as well, that when coupled with this legacy infrastructure creates kind of a very dangerous place to be.
And is legacy technology still a concern or risk or problem in your departments?
Certainly for the FBI, it's a concern for us. We're trying to be smart as we're doing our IT modernization, that we're not just doing iterative, taking the next model of the things that we've always used before, but trying to take those technological leaps forward that more modern networking has allowed us, in terms of instead of relying on physical infrastructure all the time, trying to move to more network-based outcomes. So, there's quite a bit that we're trying to do to get off of old legacy, because we do see the risk in sitting on it.
I would also add that we found from the assessments that we do that particularly the elections infrastructure had a tremendous amount of legacy systems across the states and localities. They simply didn't have the resources to be able to afford to invest in upgrading or even patching some of their systems. So we were able to provide them specific guidance as to how they might go about mitigating those circumstances. And also certainly Congress has provided over $350 million in the last several months to ensure that the states are able to afford upgrading.
Dylan, are you seeing the similar concerns with the agencies that you work with?
Yeah, I think they're universal concerns, and I'll say even further, they're industry concerns. The reality is that these types of things tend to become enforcement and compliance after a terrible disaster, right? I mean, laws get written to correct mistakes that only happen one time, and I think that industry in general needs to partner better with the government to create a more proactive stance towards security. I think that a lot of the diversification you see in our industry is for the sake of diversification's sake. So I could say that widget A is better than widget B in a way that no one really cares about who's actually an operator of that technology. And I think that as custodians of the technology, I mean, you mentioned that 90% of the critical infrastructure is owned or operated by private industry. Private industry makes everything, right? I mean, the government operates equipment, they operate the mission, but that technology comes from private industry, and I just can't stress enough that leaning in as a commercial entity to the folks who are here on the stage is one of the most critical things we can do to participate in securing our nation.
All right. So going back to the power grid mentioned, I wanted to ask, I was covering a hearing last week, the Homeland Security Committee's hearing about Russia's election meddling, and Christopher Krebs, the Undersecretary of NPPD at DHS, he was asked if he thought that Russia's recent cyber war on Ukraine's critical infrastructure and their power grid was essentially a testing ground for techniques and what's to come. And Krebs agreed, and I think it's been written about and discussed since that blackout. But I wanted to ask your opinions and thoughts, if you thought that was a fair assessment, and regardless what we're doing as a nation in your respective organizations to thwart that potential threat or react or identify an attack like that if it were to happen. Whoever would like to jump in.
All right, I figure I have to take that one, right? So certainly I agree with our Undersecretary's comments in regards to the nature of the threat, but we're seeing not only criminal enterprises that are trying to affect critical infrastructure via cyber attacks, but certainly nation states have become more of an issue as we've seen over the last few years. I think the government has worked hard to try to figure out what is the right stance that they take in terms of supporting in regards to addressing nation-state threats, and I think we've been able to be effective in a number of ways in terms of providing the information and the mitigation support that is needed.
I'd agree with that. I think the other thing we need to remember here is don't get distracted by the shiny object. We're talking about one adversary today, but there are many other adversaries out there that would be just as interested in affecting commerce, in stealing your secrets, in stealing your commercial secrets, and influence things in federal, state, local, tribal governments around the world. So we need to, not just, we tend to focus on one threat at a time. We need to keep our eyes open that the threats are much more global that are coming at us day in and day out.
Do you think we have the systems or the infrastructure in place to respond to an attack like that? I mean, if the power grid went out or any critical infrastructure was taken down, do you feel confident that we would be able to respond or come back from something like that?
I think it depends on how you define respond to. If you're talking about counter effect against the adversary, that's an area that I can't speak to because that's outside of the mandate of what the Bureau does. But in terms of responding and being able to help recover from that incident response and recovery, certainly we all have a role to play. And as we were talking about earlier, it's a team sport. It's not, DHS rolls in and saves the day, or FEMA rolls in and saves the day, or the Bureau rolls in and saves the day. We have to work collectively.
That's right. I would also add, I think we're looking to each of the critical infrastructure sectors to build their resilience. I wanted to specifically point out a really fantastic example, the Financial Services Analytic Resource Center, FSARC, which has stood up in the last couple of years. It's a very powerful unification of a lot of different analytic capabilities whereby they're working with the government, within the private sector companies, to ensure that they're really taking a very deep and sophisticated look at not just the operational cyber incidents that are going on. That's fairly common, but they really are taking a much deeper approach to thinking about what overall threats there are and what the adversaries might be trying to attempt. So it's exciting to see that type of activity ongoing, and we're looking forward to other sectors being mature enough to take on that type of enterprise.
Right. Wonderful. Well, I wanted to open up the floor for Q&A. We have a couple minutes left. Does everyone have a question for our panelists?
Hi, thank you. My question, after I've also watched some of the hearings, with the Election Assistance Commission, and there was, I guess, a statement made that information and intelligence is coming to the state CIOs at classified levels, but where to take action and work locally is not at that cleared level. So I understand sometimes there are cross-domain solutions that can help with taking classified information and transferring it to a classification level that's, disseminatable to those who can receive it. So I wanted to understand, is that one strategy, or what are the strategies to share threat information that may be at one level, but where it needs to take action is another level? And, regarding technology, is the CDS the solution, or what are you looking into for solutions?
To address the classified information issue, we are government-wide sharing both classified information and unclassified information with both the state, local, tribal, and territorial entities, as well as private sector. There are cleared individuals within the private sector, as well as cleared individuals now with the states. So we're able to get the information out that we need to get out in a timely fashion. But do keep in mind that there's both operational types of information, cyber threat indicators that can be shared, although they are seen at the classified level. We're able to push them down very quickly in an automated fashion to ensure that the states have the information that they need. There's a program called Automated Indicator AIS. I was the program manager. Can't remember what the S is, but that's all right. Which shares machine time, real-time machine-to-machine information, the cyber threat indicators, so that no human has to intervene. It's pushed out automatically. That goes to the states through the MS-ISAC, which is the multi-state ISAC, and they're able to act on that information. It goes to a wide range of folks. We have stood up the Election Elections Infrastructure, ISAC, which pushes this information to over 1,000 members within the states and localities. So I think that has been extremely effective. I would also highlight the success of ISACs within our various sectors. They are absolutely critical and fundamental in making sure the information is shared at unclassified levels as quickly as possible.
At a larger level, I think that what you're really talking about is an information dissemination problem. And if you look at the rate information is being created and the rate it's being consumed and how do you share it with such a varied audience, you're looking at inter-object level permissions management. And as recently as a couple years ago, that's not even possible to think about. With the advent of blockchain and AI, you're going to see industry start to innovate around the ability to provide you a feed that's tailored for your individual identity based on attributes, location, role in the organization that is emerging.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, Alfredo Diaz from NALPA. Jacob, thanks to NARPA, we all have a lot of comfort in our daily life. Believe me, if you know you can ask him. Has DARPA do a very extensive research on the artificial intelligence and a program aggressive enough to compare to other nations overseas?
Sure. So I think DARPA's always been investing heavily in AI. A lot of the kind of excitement of AI in the recent time has actually been from exploiting algorithms that were developed partially due to DARPA's funding back in the 80s and 90s that just now, between faster network links, faster processors, or specialized processing units are now able to actually work at the scale that we're looking for. And DARPA continues to invest heavily in AI from very early stage, fundamental, what will be the next kind of areas of AI, through how do we apply that to specific national intelligence and national security means, and then also where can we use AI to make technology just that much better. So yes, we're continuing to invest in that at a sizable amount, yes.
All right. Well, a big thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.